It's really, really easy to read a question and see what you want to see, because you're like, oh, I know the answer to that.
I'd even just have the abbreviated photosynthesis equation, maybe a drawing of a leaf, and think about how the gases go in and out.
Things like reflex action came up. There was a big 6-mark question on that.
Today I'm joined with Dr. Whelband and Mr. Taylor. How are you?
Very good, thanks.
Good. Today we're going to be talking about and preparing for Friday's GCSE Biology Paper 2, giving you tips and advice that will hopefully help you before the exam. We've got a list of questions here and we're going to get straight into it. So the first one, could you tell us about Biology Paper 2 itself and how it will be different from Paper 1?
Yeah, okay, so we'll probably be talking mainly about AQA, which is the specification that we teach here, so we would advise that you probably go away and check your specification, but Paper 2 covers topics 5 to 7 on AQA, which is homeostasis and response, it's inheritance, variation and evolution, and its ecology. Okay. So there's only actually 3 topics in this paper. There was 4 in Paper 1, but it does cover quite a breadth of the syllabus. It is an hour and 45 minutes, that's 100 marks. So you've got about a minute a mark, which I think is probably quite important to realise when you're going through your paper, to sort of for timing. And 10% of your marks will be maths calculations. That was the same actually on Paper 1 as well, but I think you probably need to make sure that you've got all of your maths skills. Yeah, sorry, I made on.
Okay. Yeah, what advice would you give to people who didn't do so well in Paper 1? Is there anything that they can change and work on for Paper 2?
Well, yeah, I think often people who haven't done as well on Paper 1 probably, as Dr. Whelband has said, is concentrate on their maths a little bit, make sure that they've got their, we'll talk a bit more about the types of maths we'll need, but make sure they've got their maths on point. I think also we have these blocks of work called required practicals that they have to do, and the required practicals for this paper for AQA, there's 4 of them. There is required practicals 7 to 10 to investigate the effect of a factor on a human reaction time, investigate the effect of light or gravity on the growth of newly germinated seedlings, to measure population size of common species in a habitat, and to investigate the effect of temperature on the rate of decay of fresh milk. Depending on which exam you're doing, you could be doing the combined syllabus or you could be doing the separate sciences. The separate sciences require you to do the gravity on the seedling or the rate or growth on a newly germinated seedling, and the effect of temperature on the rate of decay of fresh milk. Whereas for the combined sciences, they don't need those 2. I think if you focused on these required practicals a little bit more, although it only really accounts for about 15% would be directly questioned on that, it gives you a good basis of going through all of the different techniques and different theories and the ideas behind those 3 topics that Dr. Whelband identified before.
Yeah, so we are now just a few days before the exam now. What tips would you give about how to plan your revision from now until the exam?
Well, I'll take this again.
Yeah,
thank you. There's this idea, there was a chap called Ebbinghaus, and he had a forgetfulness curve. Basically he plotted this curve of forgetfulness, where if you revise, then you remember a certain amount a day later, 2 days later. If you revise and then you glance back over, I don't mean do all the same work again, but I mean just glance back over your notes or your mind maps, whatever technique's best, and you do that. You just keep going back. You're doing more revision, but you keep just glancing back. Then you're more likely to remember and be comfortable with the ideas before you get there. That's good advice for revision, full stop. But in these last few days, you want to avoid going into the panic zone. There's no need to panic.
Right, yeah.
You know, it's about little and often and just touching back on what you've known already to just keep yourself confident before the exam.
Yeah, I'd probably maybe identify some of those maybe slightly more difficult concepts, or the ones that you think you're not so sure about. Maybe review those first and get those sort of under your belt, and then you can maybe review everything.
And then that should stop the panic building up, I think.
So also MSE viewers always ask us about what type of questions might come up in the exam. Have you got any advice on that?
Obviously, we never know. If you look at sort of last year's paper, things like reflex action came up. There was a big 6-mark question on that, and there was global warming. There was random and systematic sampling. There was a comparison on mitosis and meiosis. That isn't to say that they won't come up again, but some of the things probably, maybe the larger topics that are missing were the menstrual cycle and contraception. On the biology only paper, that wasn't on there, so there is a potential for a question to come up on that. Again, biology only, there was nothing really on the uses of plant hormones, which could be a potential topic. The advantages and disadvantages of sexual and asexual reproduction would probably, be something that I would look over. And genetic engineering would be another good topic. I think that they could. I didn't notice anything on last year's paper, so they would be some good areas. But I think also going back to what Mr. Taylor said is, if you are really okay with those core practicals in this paper, there will be questions that come up on those core practicals, so you can kind of feel confident that that a question will come up regarding those practicals. So I think it's really important as well to focus on those.
So would it be possible to give us a few examples of different types of worded questions that might come up, and how would you approach that?
Yeah, okay, so I think probably here it's very difficult to actually come up with a question, but it's about the command terms, identifying what the command term actually is in the question. Now, you will all know when the command terms, when you see it, so it would be describe, explain, compare and contrast, those sorts of things. And I think probably the two that really you need to differentiate between are the describe and the explain. So describe can be just give an account, so it might be describe what you know about this, or quite often it will be associated with a graph. And I think probably the best advice that I can tell you when describing a graph is, first of all, describe the overall trend of the graph, and use the data, so use points on the graph to help you describe the trend. And also make sure you always describe any changes in the gradient. So if, for instance, it's a little bit steeper in a certain part, make sure you describe when that happens, where it occurs. So I think that's probably the best advice in terms of graphs. So that's trends, use the data, any changes in gradient. And you've got to differentiate describe from explain. Explain is why something happened. So describe is give an account. Explain is why did that happen. Okay, so if it's a graph, you've got to explain why, for instance, there was a change in gradient at a particular point. So yeah, that's
good advice. So with biology, you're sometimes writing for a long time. How would you plan an answer when you see the exam question?
Well, I think if we go back to your revision phase, I think revising, thinking about a 6-mark question, thinking through a whole kind of topic is really useful. And myself personally, I've always found that little diagrams really help. So if it was a question about photosynthesis, for instance, I'd even just have the abbreviated photosynthesis equation, maybe a drawing of a leaf, and think about how the gases go in and out and what's happening with the water, etc. And use that as just a little diagram in the top corner, and it would give me a structure. But you do need to kind of practice some of the main themes, how you're going to set out a much larger 6-mark answer, so that you can practice what your little diagram might be, to give you that comfort of being able to work through it systematically.
Yeah. Right, so leading on from that, what about those who struggle understanding some of the topics? How can they prepare the best for paper 2?
Well, I think that if they haven't already, they could still purchase like a CGP revision guide that's sometimes written in a slightly different language. They need to be looking at their notes. They need to be trying to make the best sense of their notes, looking at the syllabus and identifying the key topic areas, really. And I think it's really important for them to remember that even though they're not attending formal lessons, maybe some of them still are and maybe some are on revision leave, their teachers are still there and they're still a resource to be used. It might be useful, however, to be going through the revision and make a list of the bits that they're struggling with, so that they don't just walk in and go, I don't know biology, because that's not very helpful to anybody, themselves or to the teacher. But if they went in with a list of, I'm really struggling with this, they could talk to their teacher, they could look in a different guide, and maybe that would help them understand it from a different point of view.
Okay, cool. So if people have left their revision to the last minute, can they still do some useful things that would help them in the exam?
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on it earlier, is that, you know, even just the night before, it's surprising what you can actually take in.
Yeah.
I probably would go back to what I said earlier, and that maybe out of those 3 topics, think about the things that you really weren't particularly comfortable on, and maybe go over those things first. And because it might be that other stuff actually you're okay on. So I would probably maybe go over the harder topics first.
I think you're right. I think people often shy away from the things they find hardest and think, I'll never get that. But the reality is they end up just massaging their ego, looking at the things that they do know, and they're always worried about this little closet of information that they're worried about. So I'd say exactly the same as Dr. Whelband. I think have a look at the stuff that they struggle with, and it's never too late to just keep looking over your notes and make yourself more comfortable.
Yeah. What are the most common mistakes that people might make in the exam?
I think probably for me personally, it's not reading the question properly. Even as a biology teacher, having done it for many years, I tend to read the question maybe 3 times just to make sure that I really have got a good grasp of what they're asking, because it's really, really easy to read a question and see what you want to see, because you're like, oh, I know the answer to that. I would just say make sure you read it several times, identify what the command term is and what they're actually asking you to do. I think that's probably...
Yeah, I think that's good advice. And answer the question rather than just splurge all of your knowledge out onto the paper just because you want to write a good answer. You've got to, as Dr. Whelband says, identify the command term and write what the question's asking.
Okay, yeah. And finally, are there any tips for getting those extra marks?
Okay, so probably... have you got any top tips?
Well, yeah, I think we haven't gone back to the maths, and I think being secure in the maths. I know it's only 10% of the paper, but being secure in the maths, thinking about surface areas, thinking about reaction times, maybe
percentage change.
Percentage change is a big one.
Percentage change is a big one. Make sure you can calculate percentage change.
Up and down.
Yeah.
And be comfortable with showing your workings as well, okay, on the maths, because even if you made a little mistake, so many people don't show their workings and then write the wrong answer, and out of 3 marks they've lost all 3, whereas if they showed their workings they could even get 2 out of those 3, even if they didn't get the right answer in the end.
Check, quite often they're asking for certain numbers of significant figures, so check that. Don't forget units.
Yeah.
And
in fact, I would say when you're doing your workings, put your units on all the way through to make sure if there's any conversions that you're systematically staying on top of that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And good luck, everybody.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exam time can be challenging. If you're finding it difficult to cope, follow the links in the description for information on the support available.